They write about games in specialized outlets and in general outlets. And I think this is really important because journalists really shape how we understand games, how the general public connect with the games. So, Ivan, tell us who they are.
Yes, we have the privilege of having, as you said, 4 top journalists in the world, but also 4 of my personal favorites.
Yeah.
So I'm double excited about this. We're talking about Brian Crecente, who is the moderator of the session, and the one that helped me put this amazing session together. He's the founder of Kotaku, he's the co-founder of Polygon, and he's been writing amazing stories for media such as Rolling Stone or Variety for many, many years. That makes him at least as old as I am, so I hope he doesn't mind that I mentioned this. And he's in a very, very good company of Janet Garcia, who writes for one of the top industry media outlets, IGN. We have also in the panel Jim Park, who does an amazing job writing for one of the top general media outlets in the world, that is the Washington Post, about talking about culture and video games.
Yeah.
Such an important role. And we have Khalief Adams, who, if you don't know him, is the guy behind the chief captain of Spawn on Me, a podcast that I strongly, strongly recommend you to listen to if you haven't so far.
Okay, people, so write this down. Can you repeat the name of the podcast?
Spawn on Me.
Spawn on Me.
Really something that is really worth
we should be listening to it
stop by.
Okay, Ivan, and what is going to be the topic? Because with everything that is happening in the world right now, journalism and communicators are really important also for the video games industry. So what is going to be the talk about?
Well, the topic, I would say the general topic is the evolution of game journalism. Okay. Since the times where game journalism was more about, reviewing games or announcing games, to the world we live today, where games have become one of the most influential medium of
creating culture and creating understanding of the world.
Okay. But I think more important than the topic is the intention of the panel. The intention of the panel is highlighting the enormous influence of game journalism in how games are understood, as you said, but also in how games are created. Because game creators, all of us working in the games industry, we need to listen. We listen very carefully to what this kind of journalists write about games, how they project the games to the audiences and to ourselves.
And they can get that feedback to improve
exactly
the next game.
We need to listen to them to create a better medium.
Okay.
And with that purpose, with that intention, we have invited, as you said, 4 top journalists, 4 of the most influential journalists in the world.
Okay, so I can wait. Something.
Yeah, we want to welcome to Gamelab stage virtually, of course, as in any other session, Khalief Adams, Janet Garcia, Jim Park, and Brian Crecente.
Hello, guys.
Hello, everyone. It's
hello.
Enormous pleasure and honor to have you with us virtually in Barcelona, hopefully soon also physically. But for the moment, we are privileged. We feel privileged to have you connected through the internet, and we are so looking forward to listening to you. So Brian, whenever you want, the stage is all yours.
Thank you, Ivan, and thank you, Elena. Really appreciate the introduction. It was very nice, and thank you to Khalief and Jean and Janet for coming to do this. I know you're all very busy, but I feel that you probably feel like I do that this is an important topic. Before we get started, I think I'd like to just have each of you take a moment to talk about how you got into what you do now, sort of your road to what you do now, and what you're currently doing. So, Jean, do you want to start?
Yeah, I probably have the most conventional in terms of media, but the most unconventional in terms of games media career path here. I was just a newspaper journalist. I majored in communications in college. Um, I took an internship in high school at my local paper, but back on Guam, and then I went into newspapers. I covered crime, I covered tourism, I covered military, I covered business, and I just kept on doing that. I did freelance for video game sites back in the late 90s and early 2000s. The last time I even attended E3 was actually back in 2003, and in between that, I just became a regular journalist. Um, I started at the Washington Post in 2015. I was a social media editor, and during that time, we were also called audience editors. And during that time, as we were planning to boost up our video game coverage, I advised on how to reach a good audience for our video game coverage. And eventually, it just ended up that I would end up writing for it.
Excellent. And then Janet, could you go next? Let's hear about how you got into what you do now.
Yeah, so I always had a passion for writing and just doing analysis. Like, I was an English major in college. I loved English all throughout my life. So at one point I just said, hey, I already have a blog where I just kind of write general things about my life as a college student and other things. Well, what if I did something with games? Like, I've always loved games. Let me just volunteer for a site just purely for fun. It originally was not my intention to make it a career, but I kind of kept pulling that thread, and I volunteered for another blog that kind of did a more holistic coverage of games. So at first I did mobile game reviews for free. Then I was doing features and reviews and podcasts with other creators that I liked, still unpaid, but just really enjoying it. And then I thought, you know what, I'm going to take this to the next level. I want to explore this as a career. And that's when I transitioned into being like, okay, I'm only going to do work if I'm paid for it, because now I am trying to build a career. So I started writing for small outlets. I did a YouTube channel that was also a podcast. I really just kind of tried to double down on filling out every aspect of my resume and kind of what it takes to be in the games industry today. And I kept pushing towards that. Eventually, I went full-time into freelance because I felt really limited in having a day job, which I think a lot of freelancers can feel that pain of having to pay bills, but trying to build a career at night. It's very, very difficult. So I'm like, I'm going to go all in on it. And all I did was everything just related to games. I did news coverage, I did reviews, I did features, I did guides, I did YouTube, and I just kind of really tried to max everything out. And after a little bit under a year of doing that, I was lucky enough that a position for guides at IGN opened up. I had already been freelancing for guides at IGN, so naturally I applied to the position and I got it, and I've been at IGN as an associate editor for the guides team for a year now.
Well, great. And now, Khalief, one of the things that I think is so cool about the fact that all of you are doing this is that there's so many different things that you guys are doing. And I think it's different reflections, mainstream, IGN for web. And then, Khalief, what you do is so important and so different. So let's hear a little bit about how you got into this.
Yeah, I had a really unfulfilling IT job that I was doing for 10 years and was sitting behind a desk feeling really bad and not feeling like I was using my brain a lot. I've been playing games since I was 3. I'm now 41. So it was a moment when I said, I want to figure out a way to talk about this stuff in a way that makes me feel like I'm using my brain, feeling smart and feeling fulfilled. And I made a blog. So I made a blog called the Small Point Blog about eight years ago now at this point. And then ran that for a bit. We were really lucky. We got a really good signal boost from the folks over at Sony around a game called Sound Shapes that I was doing interviews with folks in the community. They snatched up some of that content and said, can we put it on our blog? And then that was one of the first layers of me getting into the industry in a real way. Move forward a couple of years later, the blog goes away, and I meet a gentleman named Cicero Holmes who helped me to found Spawn on Me. And I was just playing games on Twitch and we had a conversation and he jumped into the room, was like, hey, do you have a site? I was like, yeah. I was like, totally. If you want to write, we can do some stuff. And then like a year later, we decided to do a podcast. And then fast forward a little bit more, we figured out like what the niche was that we wanted to kind of hit. And it was about spotlighting people of color in the industry. It was always a conversation that I had in the back of my mind about, wanting to see people like myself in the gaming industry talking about games, because there weren't a lot of us in that space at that time. And yeah, it's been a really wild ride. It's been really cool to see people gravitate to the work and pay attention to it in real ways and feel like we're moving the needle in some form or fashion with the work that we do. That also parlayed me into an actual 9-to-5 job. So yeah, it's been a really cool ride so far.
Very cool. So let's talk a little bit because you guys all come from sort of these different entry points. I would love to hear each of you sort of talk about, and feel free to chime in, obviously, any of you, but talk about sort of this evolution of games journalism, because it's sort of, from my perspective, you go all the way back to print magazines and then sort of birth of these websites and then blogs. And over time, the entry of influencers and mainstream media. So I'm just curious if any of you have any thoughts on how gaming coverage has evolved over the years.
It's been wild. I mean, I just knowing from my own personal experiences, it's been, I was one of the kids who would go to the comic book store and go pick up an EGM magazine and read that from cover to cover, or a GameSpot magazine and read that from cover to cover. And reminding myself of just how many people were in that particular space when it started, and how, I guess, I don't know if it was fruitful, but I know it was a thing that, I, as a person who loved games, would use as my resource to do that. And then seeing the blogosphere grow into a real space, and folks be able to talk about things from a personal perspective without having a bunch of corporate backing to be able to do that work, was also really interesting. And then you kind of get into the podcasting and video space, where podcasts were, for me, a prominent part of games coverage. It was where I learned about personalities that made sense when it comes to talking about the games that they loved, but also kind of digging into the why and the what and the how. Like, it was the first connection I had between game players and developers in a real way. Came from kind of the podcasting space. And then, of course, YouTube became huge. And then now we see the influencer space be a huge part of the way that not only games are talked about, but the way that they're marketed. So there's a lot of different layers to this cake that have come up over the past, 20 years at this point. And it continues to feel like it's evolving. I'm not sure where the next step is. It's madness how not long it is.
Exactly.
Yeah, for sure.
Games are like the youngest medium that we have by a lot. And that's why there are people that are in the industry now, and they're like, I remember the Intellivision, or like, obviously things much older than that, because the history is actually not that old. So it makes sense that we have like people that are making content that can trace all the way back that way, which is also why I think it's really important and awesome when there are new creators who are coming up and can kind of speak on their new perspective on entering in the industry, because it's become so different, as Khalief was saying. For me, I think one of the biggest changes in game coverage is the advent of social media, and how that has changed not just how we get our news and share the news, but also I think in some ways it can remove a lot of barriers. Obviously, networking is very difficult, and Khalief, I think your work on elevating people of color and other minority voices is so essential, because that is still an uphill battle in our industry and across many industries. But I love that, like, you can send out a tweet and like someone at Sony Santa Monica might see it, and they'll respond to you and they'll have that conversation. I think breaking down those barriers and having a direct line to your audience and to other gamers and other creators is really what has opened up games media to people that you might not have seen before. I think that, alongside things like Patreon and Ko-Fi, where you can just say, you know what, I am having, for whatever reason, I can't get my voice on these mainstream outlets. I'm going to go ahead and make my own thing. And I did that when I was a freelancer. I had my own Patreon, and it didn't get too crazy big, but I was making $100 a month just off Patreon. And I always thought it was so cool that I'm like, oh, these are people that are fans of me, and they roll with me, and they believe in the vision that I have, and they want to support, and they want to see me grow. And I always kind of angle that too, as like, this community that I'm creating, like, this is team get a job at a mainstream outlet. Like, you guys are helping me do that work so that I can get there, and you're watching my journey and joining in on that. And I think there's something like really inspiring and exciting about those. Like, I love being that person to other people, like the fact that I now have the influence where people can get excited speaking to me, and I can be that direct line. I think the industry has a lot of, challenges and darkness to it, but those kind of things make me really inspired. And I just think it's so cool that you can pick up a cell phone and just be like, I'm going to start a YouTube channel and just put the camera down, and any kid or person, or you don't really need to have as many resources to get your voice out there. And I think that's the big difference over the years.
For me, you all touched on something that's a challenge for a reporter like me. I just posted my thoughts on The Last of Us 2, and one of the tweets that responded to me was, "Well, I don't know who Gene Park is, so I don't know if I can believe him." And to be fair, that's a very, very fair point, because that is that is the media environment that we're in. That the communities in these different games and these different online communities need to feel like they need to trust the people and the brand that they have behind. Khalief, I think, is paving the way and is on the forefront of that, because then people will be like, "Oh, I trust Khalief Adams. I know what he rolls with. I know what Janet rolls with." As for me, I'm with the Washington Post, so the comments I'll get is, "Well, you're just owned by Bezos, and you're just going to do whatever he says." And like, for me, that's a challenge that I have to combat against, because I need people to know who I am. I need people to know that I have my own very much my own gaming thoughts. That's been the real shift, I think, as Janet talked about, in what social media empowered people to do. Everyone's just kind of become their own outlet, and everyone has their own communities to cater to, their own beat reporters for certain games, like this YouTuber that I like in the Netherlands or whatever. He only covers Ubisoft and Sony games, and it's very limiting, and like one outlet would do that. But I rely on this one dude to keep me updated on all the information on Assassin's Creed Valhalla, trolling through all the Reddit threads and all that stuff. He's doing all that work that I wouldn't be able to do, So it's really interesting to see how fragmented and how niche a lot of the kind of journalism that we're seeing is happening.
Yeah, it's interesting because it would not be fair to say that mainstream media is just now starting to cover video games, because there have been sort of fits and starts over the years, going back, 10, 15 years. But I feel like, and I should say, for full clarity, I did help a little bit with some consulting on the Washington Post with the Washington Post when they were launching. But basically, I just gave them some advice. They did an amazing job of launching and really didn't need my help. But having said that, I think what the Washington Post is doing is fascinating, because it, having looked at or participated in coverage of video games from mainstream outlets for a while, from a lot of different sort of companies and publishers, it feels more like any other place. It feels like your coverage, Gene, is fitting very neatly in with the Washington Post. Like, I don't feel like even though there is sort of the launcher page, I feel like when I'm reading stuff on the Washington Post about video games, I'm still reading the Washington Post. And I'm just curious, was that something you guys were trying to do? Like, what was your thoughts when it came to that?
That's interesting. My own thoughts is scattered, because when you say that it sounds like or reads like the Washington Post, I almost take that as an insult, to be quite frank.
Come on, you guys have all kinds of great things going on.
Yeah, exactly. But to be quite, huh? Yeah, I mean, like, you can say that about any outlet too, you can say that about Kotaku or IGN, right? But like, I'm trying to bridge the gap between what someone who really understands video games, someone who doesn't understand video games, to let them kind of really see the value of why we engage in this art, of what we take out of it, and this really all comes back to what Khalief was saying about blogs. I mentioned earlier that I was writing in the early 2000s. It was for a site called GameCritics.com, and it was a really small site based out of New York. And the whole idea of the site was that we were going to look at games as art, at how we feel, and that mindset really continues to permeate through my brain. I want people to understand that a game like The Last of Us 2 is a significant cultural milestone, as much as something like League of Legends or Fortnite would be too.
I'm curious, Janet, how long have you been at IGN now?
A little over a year now. for full time.
So you're relatively new there full time. Do you? I'm very curious about sort of the evolving view on, as a writer and a journalist. Do you see IGN as, maybe you don't want to answer this because you work there now, but like, is that a stepping stone to go mainstream, or like, do you like, there's some people who feel like it's not, you're not validated until you're working for a newspaper or magazine or TV. Like, what is your view in terms of IGN in context of all this stuff going on?
I think it's about obviously what you want to do personally in your career and what you find fulfilling ultimately. I think it's dangerous for especially new journalists or up and coming journalists to get caught up in the clout game. I'm not going to lie and say that it wasn't thrilling to have my first byline on Kotaku and that it didn't make me feel a little validated. I think that's natural. And it's also me respecting the work it takes to get to an outlet like Kotaku or like Polygon and being like, it's, in a way an honor to have my work edited by someone that is so skilled and has had such experience and that they see me as valuable. I think there's nothing wrong with feeling validated by bigger outlets. And I would feel super excited to have something in the Washington Post or a lot of other media companies that I admire. So for me, what I liked about IGN and why it was sort of my dream job to be there was because it is the biggest in the gaming vertical. But gaming is also very small. So like, there are a lot of people that don't play games that don't know what IGN is. Like I've had to explain my job plenty of times to people. Like it's not cloudy in that way. But that's okay with me because I love feeling like I'm in the top of kind of mainstream game coverage. And obviously IGN excels at kind of the big picture, but other websites can arguably excel in different verticals, deep dives. Maybe they do have different things that make them special and valuable. So just because, I think a lot of times we position IGN #1 gaming outlet, and in a lot of ways that is true, but that doesn't mean that we are the perfect fit for every writer or what every writer aspires to do. For me, it was because I wanted to have the most reach. I love the idea of just getting to do all the things that you think of that when you think game journalism, having access to big events and being able to do larger reviews and being able to, for guides specifically, like our Game Hub coverage is like some of the best out there because we have a longer history than other outlets just in that alone, as well as like other things we do. Like I liked being involved in that team. So that's kind of how I feel on that matter. And I think when it comes to what you want to do and thinking about whether or not you want to be at a mainstream outlet or a specific outlet, or whether or not you want to be independent, I think there are a lot of different options for creators out there. And I think it's good to be also open to experimenting with different stuff and trying it out and seeing what makes you feel, kind of like to echo what Khalief said before, like invigorated, excited to get up and do the work. And for some people, that is just running, Animal Crossing, was it Pocket News? That Twitter was phenomenal. It's like one of the best out there. If that is your passion, like that person goes in there and they rock that niche every day and it's incredible. And I look to that work as, someone who's worked on the Animal Crossing guide. Like that was, they did excellent content. So you can be that person. You can be the person that only Twitch streams games from the PS1. Like you can do that. And I think that's really exciting. So it's about figuring that out. I think one interesting thing too with voice, that's something that we also struggle with at IGN, even being like a gaming outlet, people will still be like, I don't know you and I don't trust you, or I don't know what your taste is. And we're finding, for us as an outlet evolving, we're trying to think of ways that we can showcase personalities without also drowning out the voice of the site. And that's kind of what teamwork is all about. Like, trying to figure out that balance. Like one thing we just implemented is at the bottom of all our reviews now, we have like other reviews by that author, and you can kind of quickly glance, okay, what are the last 3 reviews that Jonathan Dornbush did, or Janet Garcia did, or whoever Dan Stapleton wrote, and get a little bit of a sense of who that person is. Like we're trying to highlight that because we know that readers care about it. So for other outlets, I think adapting may appear in different ways than it would if you're an independent creator.
Right. No, that's all interesting. It's also, I think it's really fascinating that it's, externally when people talk about games journalism, it's sort of singular in terms of what a game journalist does. But you, Janet, you did such a great job of just pointing out now, there are so many aspects. Like I've written game reviews in the past, but that's not my forte. They're like, when I was at Polygon, that's what Arthur did, and he had a team that did that. And I did news and we had a features team. The point is that there are so many different ways to cover video games, and I think all of them are meaningful, but it's very easy for people to, look at a reporter or a site and say, oh, they're this one thing, and that's not really true. Now, Khalief, maybe you obviously are very focused on what you do, and it actually brings up something I really want to talk about, because I think it's massively misunderstood, and that is the importance of people of color and minority voices in both video game stories, but also in game journalism. I think that there are some people who might view that as tokenism, or that you don't need to worry about that. I'll tell you my personal belief, but I would love to hear what you all think about this. I think that when you're building out a publication, or if you're hiring people, you want to have diverse voices, because you don't want everybody to come at it from the same angle. You want to have people who have different life experiences, and those different life experiences are vastly tied to the fact that maybe they are a minority or a person of color. And excluding that or not looking out for that can really turn your site into something that's got a very sort of monotone look, and also you'll miss out on very important stories that need to be told. So anyway, that's my perspective. Khalief, I'm sure you've thought a lot more about this, because it's a lot of what you do with your podcast. But again, I'd love to hear what your thoughts are on this.
I mean, I echo what you just shared, because it's really important, and I find it really interesting because of the way that a lot of the community comes to these conversations from their prisms, especially folks who aren't people of color, kind of jumping into the fray and asking a lot of questions that feel academic in ways, but also feel like in a space that is unnecessary sometimes. So, for instance,
put up the glasses on your nose.
Just a question, please.
I wish I had a hat, a trivia or something to put on.
I'm sure there's somebody in the back of every room with a fedora with a feather in it saying, "Why do you want to talk about black stuff as a black person?" I'm like, "Well, because I'm black."
Well,
it's those conversations, right? Where as a person who does this content, and I never have shied away from the conversation that although the stuff that we talk about on the show comes through a prism of blackness, through my self-experience, through my experiences and all those things, it never excludes anyone from enjoying the content. All the content that we do is for everyone, but the things that I may see, or the things that may raise flags or be interesting, sometimes those things come through that prism of my self-experience, which is a self-experience of blackness as an American. So I think that being able to share stories from groups, not only of my own but from others who have been kind enough to share those on our show, I'm always learning. That's the beauty of this work, is that I'm always learning something new about other people, and I'm always learning something different about other people's experiences and how they play the games that they play and what they see. So like, one of my favorite shows we did was one around Mafia 3, one of the blackest games on the planet. But the interesting part was talking about that to other black folks and saying, what was your experience when these things were coded into the game to represent racism and discrimination? Did you feel like they did a good job? Other folks outside of that group wouldn't really necessarily be able to give you a good answer on that in a perspective that they would have. So like, you'd have a bigger outlet that may not necessarily have a lot of brown folks working there. And if they would try to cover that thing, and at least that angle of it, they would probably get it wrong, right? So I think, like, besides the fact that it's great for the space and for the industry, we add value to coverage. Those perspectives add value to your outlet in a way that is one that doesn't really get a lot of lip service in the same ways that other things do. So it's a good conversation to have about, like, how do you add that to your roster. But I think in terms of media in general, having those voices have their own outlets is even more important. You know what I mean? Like, I wouldn't be able to do this work. I don't think I'd be able to do this work at a GameSpot or an IGN in the same way. And that's honest. I don't know. I don't think I'd be able to do it and say things as fully throated as I am able to do so with the platform that I have. So we're hoping to see that kind of grow in different directions and folks kind of get into spaces. But you have to either do that work and do it a lot, because we've been doing this for 10 years and now we're starting to get a bunch of love. And most people don't last that long in space. So that's a part of that conversation too.
And I want to hear from both Janet, you and Gene, but just one thing I wanted to add to that. it's great, I think, on the one hand, to have a major outlet hiring people like yourself. But the reality is, we need people like you to create your own platforms where you can hire people. Like, that's just as important. And you know, it's something you have to keep in mind, because I think supporting you and trying to other people, trying to make sure that people know of you and hear about you, allows you hopefully to grow. And then maybe you one day can be as big as IGN and you can hire people, as opposed to you coming in as an employee.
Yeah, let me add something to that, because that's important too. Like, I wanted to share really quickly. Like, people ask me all the time, like, Khalief, what do you want Spawn on Me to be in 10 years? And I was like, I want to be the Tyler Perry of gaming, in a weird way, where like you get to build out the system, to build out the space to be able to do that work in a real way. I want to hire people who look like us. Like, my other joke is like, I want to do the black version of the Game Awards that Jeff Keighley does. Like, I want to infuse culture into what this thing is, so that everyone who has been told for a long time that they are not in that space can see how dope the community is and how dope the culture is, and how all those things have constantly been talking to each other and been informing each other forever. So yeah, there's lots and lots of thoughts about, you know, owning the thing as opposed to just being a part of the machine. Sure, for sure.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I definitely love the idea of needing both, and that both are very important. You know, people, I think, always have that debate when it comes to diversity. Like, oh, well, you know, What's Good Games is a wonderful all-woman podcast, and you rarely see that in games media where it's just all women. And some people might say, oh, well, you know, isn't it better to kind of like have it just be mixed in? We need both. We need What's Good Games. We also just need more women on major gaming outlets on all those shows. I think both are incredibly important until we somehow everything becomes equal, which we're very, very, very far away from. So until then, we do need both of those representations. I think, to add to what Khalief already established, just to kind of build on it a little bit more, I think the other thing that having a diverse group of creators on a team does is it signals to your audience that, like, you're here because, like, I'm also here. Like, you can be here because I'm here, and I'm kind of in a way testing the waters for you and signaling to you that, like, this is a welcoming space, and it invites more people to want to collaborate and come in. And everyone feels differently about this. This is not to say that, oh, women won't listen to an all men show, or that, like, a brown woman needs to see another brown person on screen. Like, I personally don't feel that way when I choose my content, and I'm not to suggest that people do feel that way, but I do think for a lot of people it helps signal that. I had a friend that ran a small podcast for a while, and it's with people on the internet randomly. They'll hit him up, or sometimes he'll hit them up, and he had a few women approach him to say, hey, I'm interested in being on the show. And he asked, like, how did you find out about us and what made you reach out? And one thing she had said was, well, I saw you had other women on the show, so I knew that you were like that was an option. And sometimes when people don't see themselves included, they feel like, well, maybe this isn't a space for me. And I think the risk of larger outlets not having that representation, if you want to look at it from just an additional angle than the quality of perspective, it's, why would I be where I feel like I'm not welcome? And I think that, you know, having people in those spaces that can advocate and catch things in community building. I've done a lot of moderations of chats on live streams we've had, and any live stream chat on a big outlet is hard. I was looking at PlayStations and I'm like, oh, they get it just as bad as we do. I don't feel bad anymore. But that being able to catch stuff that I feel like maybe other people on my team might not, because I'm like, that's actually a microaggression. I know what this comment actually means. It may not be caught by, like, maybe someone banning, right? It's not a slur, but I know what you're trying to say with this, and I'm gonna boot this person out. So I think, in addition to perspective, just being like someone there where they're like, oh, cool. Like, it's so meaningful to me when people comment, hey, this is the first time I've seen, like, a person of color on the show, or you're one of the few people that I've seen. At the same time, it makes me sad that there's not more, and that they feel that way when they do see me. But, like, hey, at least for that moment, they're like, wow, this is really cool to see, like, a Latinx person, like, on NBC or on, you know, on our shows. And that's really meaningful to me. And I think being that person and being able to make those connections is how you get a more diverse staff over time. One of the many ways.
Right. Gene, you're at a big publication, major publication.
I can only really add to what Khalief and Janet said, and to talk about what we spoke about earlier. Part of the explosion of these social media personalities is because so many mainstream companies have not space for other people. So people are trying to do. It's why Khalief has that dream of becoming the Tyler Perry of video gaming, because there isn't that, and so he's capitalizing. It's smart, but also there hasn't been a space. And these days, and especially in the past week, in light of everything, we've been having very open conversations about what diversity looks like in leadership. And I think it's pretty obvious that, even if the cast looks diverse, even if you have an all-women cast, like the people signing the paychecks are still very much all white and all male and very much cishet. So we're just not seeing that, and we're not really getting great feedback even in the last week in terms of how they dress us, because all we get is the same excuse that we've been hearing for literally decades, which is we're going to have an internal policy review. What happened? I don't know, and then it just all. Yeah, exactly. It's like, God, I did not know that.
No one said anything. Like, I'm like, what?
Exactly. So no surprise that people are out doing their own thing. No surprise that gamers are trusting individuals and smaller outlets versus the larger outlets, because we facilitated the need for that space. That's what I'm saying. So I guess my message to leadership is, if you want to stop having good competition, then just be better at it. That's pretty much it. Yeah.
Well, something, Janet, I wanted to point this out earlier. Something that you did or have been doing is you're creating. It's a spreadsheet, right? This sort of. Explain it, because you can do a much better job than I can. But I think it's amazing that you're doing it. I love that you're doing it.
Thank you. Absolutely. Yeah. So in light of the recent resurgence, because it's existed for a very long time, of the Black Lives Matter movement, and kind of seeing how that appears in your own industries, whether it's games media where we all are, or just other fields, people are kind of saying, okay, what are things we can do to uplift the Black community and be an ally in our own verticals? Because I'm a game journalist. I'm not the biggest. If I want to change the world, I should probably do something that isn't talking about what I thought of The Last of Us Part 2, but what can I do as someone that wants to do that and be a good person? Like, how do I kind of meld those two together? So I made a spreadsheet and put out a call there, and I still very much am accepting additional entries. It's on my Twitter, which is the handle's @GameOnysus, and it's on my pin tweet, and it's just, hey, if you're in games media to any degree and you're willing to have people hit you up with questions, maybe even have like pitches looked over, different people are available for different things given their scheduling. Let me know. I'll put your name, your handle on Twitter. Once again, social media being such a big thing in games media now. And just a little description on like, hi, I'd like to help out. I'm down to check out your pitches, or I'm down to look at your website, or I'm down to answer questions. Like answering questions is something that I've been big on to just everyone in general, but I have added myself to a list of specifically Black content creators to reach out and kind of a contact list, because one of the biggest challenges in the industry for anyone is getting in there, meeting the right people, finding your community of freelancers, of editors, of whoever to help you, last for as long as you need to last to build a successful career in this industry. So that's there. I put that together. I also have a blog called GameIndustryGuides.com, where I have an email attached to that too, where anyone can email me, and I'm slowly answering them and kind of trying to build what I wish I had as a freelancer, which is like, hey, can someone answer these kind of general questions that I think everyone has, but there's not really a good place to have that all accumulated. So trying to break down the barriers, I don't want to say secrecy, but kind of the people that know, and if you don't know, you have to figure it out. But there's not really a way to figure it out without asking strangers. So I'm trying to create a little bit of both, because some people are too shy to maybe use that list. But if you are, I also have blog posts and ways that you can be anonymous, and I can answer your question and post it so everyone can benefit. And that's what I'm currently working on right now.
That's great. It's interesting because I think a big part, there are a lot of things that sort of thread through this problem, but one of them is sort of these bubbles, I think there are a lot of people who exist, everybody sort of exists in their own bubbles. And it's very easy as you grow as a creator and become more established to forget that. You forget that you have these sort of invisible walls around you, whether or not you meant to put them up. And you may not just hear from people who, you know, could use your help. So I think what you're doing is amazing. It really tears down those walls, or in some degree kind of opens up the bubbles. We could talk about this for probably 2 or 3 hours or days, but I do want to, before we run out of time, I want to talk about one other thing that's near and dear to my heart. And with everything that's going on right now, I think it's a very important topic. And that is the notion that just because, and you sort of said this, but just because we're covering video games doesn't mean that we can't address serious topics. Back in the day when I used to run Kotaku, we used to hear that all the time. Like, I come here to hear about video games, and I don't want to hear about blood minerals or about yeah, like I want to escape. Exactly. And so I think that it is, personally, I think it's incredibly important that an aspect of what you do as a game journalist is cover the important topics. And that could be anything from you know, the excellent reporting that we've seen on different websites about mistreatment of employees, to, you know, again, blood minerals, to talking about, you know, racism, talking about all kinds of things that happen to connect to or overlap with important real world topics. I suspect you probably are all on the same side on this issue, but I'd love to hear you all talk about this. What do you think about covering important, serious world topics when you talk about video games?
I'll jump in first.
I'll go first.
Oh, no, go ahead.
Go ahead, Khalief. Go first. Go first.
Oh, real quick, I think the conversation always sparked up from a place of that one comment of like, don't put politics into my games. And I remember the day that we started the show, and I said, I don't want that to be anything that we even get near. I want us to talk about all the politics. I want us to talk about all the taboos that we have in gaming in a real way, because it's interesting. Just from a curiosity standpoint, it's just an interesting thing to talk about, because again, like, I'm sure all of us spend an unreasonable amount of time playing games, right? And to feel like those things don't touch and they shouldn't touch is such a weird thing as a concept. So getting a chance to do that work and then have people actually pay attention to that and like that stuff is so validating in lots of different ways. And it gives me a lot of respect for the folks who are willing to get down and dirty and do that work, because we see sometimes that the community is so wary or worried about, you know, bridging that weird gap that doesn't really belong there. So yeah, it's really been fun to be able to do that kind of stuff. Go ahead, Gene. Sorry about that.
No, I've just been having this conversation for so long, and like you, I just feel like it's not a conversation that's worth having, because it's silly. We worry so much about how the people who make movies, like, how they feel and what they feel like, you know, and what their politics are, even, you know. If we are so, the games industry is so desperate for validation that we never needed in the first place. And then for us to turn around and say, well, you know, just shut up about the real things, though. That's like you said, it's just very strange, weird brain space that I've never really understood. You know, back in 2002, I was calling out Call of Duty for being nationalistic military propaganda, and it's still going on, and that those takes are still being written. For me, talking about that back in 2002 to 2003 it wasn't weird to me, and it's funny that it's weird to people nowadays, you know. It's just bizarre. I don't think it's even a conversation worth having, because games are political. They're super political. So, you know, we should talk about it.
I think too, we and by we I mean kind of like the mainstream audience likes to pretend like talking about games politically is new, but it's definitely not new. Like, I was reading through like, and even being a young person, you know, if you do your research, because like internet's great, right? There's lots of older content out there that you can check out. I was reading I believe it was Polygons' oral history of Final Fantasy VII. I read it, you know, when the remake came out, to get more context. And they mentioned how back when the original came out, there were a lot of people that were critical of Barrett because he was very much like Mr. T, but not Mr. T. And they thought that it was kind of leaning into stereotypes of how Black men are. And they were citing conversations that were happening when that game came out, which was a very long time ago. So I
was in those conversations.
Yes, I think we like to pretend like the mainstream audience pretends like it's new so that we don't do it. But like we've never there've always been, you know, people of color in games. There's always been women. There's always been queer people. There's always been indie games, and there's always been like on mainstream outlets conversations about the politics of games. Because sure, there are games that maybe end up being in their own little bubbles. Like there's not. Sometimes there's stuff that comes up with Mario, but like there are some games that I'm not gonna bring up stuff that's not there. But if I'm analyzing Detroit Become Human, I would not be able to analyze that game without discussing the metaphors of racism and how that's handled and whether or not I think it's handled well. Because if you think of in like no shit, like I like that game for the design. I think it has narrative issues. Like I like the gameplay of it, but like that's part of it, right? And we should be able to do both. Like I should be able to say that, holy cow, looking at the narrative branches of that game blows my mind as someone that likes narrative games. But let's really break down what's going on here and whether or not it's effective to put something like that in a binary and breaking that down. And if I'm not willing to talk about that, I can't really analyze the story and then people will say, well, why does it have to be so deep? But I'm like, that's the story that this team told. So I can't, like, you know, if you tell me a different story, I'll have a different analysis. I think that's, we think of that with like analyzing any other art, like Jean said, like you always bring in different elements, you know, an environmental angle, a political angle, like what is, you know, to really break it down to all its pieces, you have to talk about all of it, or else you're not getting the full story. And I think the point of games media is to try to get as much of the full story as possible. And that's why we have different outlets, different voices, different angles. And together we can kind of learn more about the game and what we think about the game by reading other people's coverage, by putting it on paper, by talking on a show. And I think that's super important. And I think muting any lines of that conversation just makes for less effective criticism and enjoyment of the game.
I have so much I'd love to say about that, but I think we're close to running out of time. And frankly, Janet, you did such an amazing job of just summarizing all of that so concisely. I don't think you dropped the mic. You know, there's no need for us to wrap it up. Well, thank you all so much for doing this, and thank you to Gamelab. I think this was really fascinating. I would love, like I said, to keep talking about these topics. I think they're so important. But it's great that you all were able to do this with me, and I had a lot of fun. So thank you. And Ivan and Elena, thank you again for hosting us.
Thank you very much, guys.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Hello.
Right.
Thank you so much. It's been amazing, and I couldn't agree more with the last thing that you said, Janet, and I would just put it in a sentence. It's like games are not innocent anymore. I mean, we need to address those things in games, obviously, and the critical eye that you bring to the games industry, as I said at the beginning, is really important. And I think we as an industry, we need that. We need to make a better medium. We need to make things better, and we need to listen to people that eventually play our games and see the stories behind them, and they can help us making them better, or at least realizing what they really mean. So I think, once again, that is really important what you do. I thank you so much for doing such an amazing, inspiring jobs from your podcast, blogs, big industry and media outlets. And I will continue following you with passion. And I invite anyone that is watching us today, maybe they are in the, like, saying, who is this Jim Park that writes about the The Last of Us, right? I strongly recommend them to, if they haven't followed you before, reading your stories, listening to your stories, because they are really helpful and inspiring for any people working in the industry. Thank you so much, and hopefully I'll be able to meet you somewhere soon, somewhere safe, and even more, hopefully, in Barcelona at some point.
Thank you so much.
Thanks for your time.
Thank you so much.
Thanks.